The shout echoed across the sidewalk before anyone understood what was happening. A billionaire, a missing wallet, a black girl running away. People slowed. Some stared, most didn't move. She wasn't sprinting, she wasn't panicking, she kept glancing back. Not in fear, but with intention, like she needed him to follow, and against every instinct. Every rule, every layer of protection his life was built on. He chased her past glass towers and luxury storefronts, straight into a part of the city his name had erased from maps because the girl who stole his wallet wasn't running from him, she was leading him, and what she was about to show him would undo everything he thought he knew about success. Ownership. And guilt. Elliot Crane had spent 30 years building distance from poverty, distance from risk, distance from consequences, distance from the version of himself who once knew what it meant to have nothing. His name sat on hospitals, libraries, development projects scattered across 3 states. His company specialized in what the industry called urban renewal, the kind that came with glossy brochures and smiling renderings of the future, the kind that promised progress without mentioning the price. That morning, he was late to his own groundbreaking ceremony. A crowd waited, the mayor waited, cameras waited, investors checked their watches. The site was another vacant lot in another forgotten neighborhood, another opportunity to transform blight into value, another chance to watch his net worth climb while standing on a stage wearing a hard hat he would never need again. And yet here he was, running his shoes, Italian, polished, worth more than most people earned in a week, slapped against cracked pavement, his tailored jacket snagged on rusted metal fencing. Each step pulled him farther from the version of the city he recognized, the one with clean sidewalks and security cameras and people who knew his name for the right reasons. The girl stayed just far enough ahead to be seen, not fast, not desperate, precise. She moved like someone who had memorized every alley, every shortcut, every invisible boundary that separated one world from another. She glanced back at regular intervals, making sure he was still following, making sure he didn't lose his way before arriving at the destination she had chosen. She led him past boarded windows that hadn't seen glass in years, past houses marked with red symbols sprayed across their fronts like warnings in a language he had forgotten how to read, past empty lots where homes had been scraped away like mistakes, leaving only foundations and memories embedded in concrete graffiti. Covered the walls in layers. You took our block. Where are we supposed to go? Your profit cost us everything. Crane equals Destroyer. His name appeared again and again, transformed from something respectable into something else entirely. Something accused, something guilty. Elliot felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition, the uncomfortable awareness that comes from seeing yourself through someone else's eyes and not recognizing what you've become. He had been here before, just never on foot, never without tinted windows, separating him from what his decisions looked like in 3 dimensions. He remembered sitting in boardrooms, where neighborhoods became data points, where displacement became necessary relocation, where poverty became opportunity waiting to be unlocked. He remembered nodding along to presentations that turned people into percentages and homes into obstacles preventing maximum return on investment. He remembered signing papers, so many papers. The girl turned down an alley where sunlight barely reached, where the air smelled like rust and old rain and something burning somewhere out of sight. She moved past dumpsters and chain-link fences covered in vines that had reclaimed what humans had abandoned. Elliot's phone buzzed in his pocket. 17 missed calls, 33 unread messages. The ceremony had started without him. His absence was being noticed. Excuses were being invented. His assistant was probably having a breakdown. He kept running. Something had shifted the moment the girl looked back at him on that sidewalk. Something in her eyes that wasn't anger or fear, but certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything left to reveal. She knew something he didn't, and somehow, impossibly, he needed to know it too. The girl slowed near an overpass where traffic thundered overhead, carrying people toward places that still belonged to them, toward jobs and homes and futures that felt guaranteed rather than rented by the day below it. A different world existed. Cars lined up like makeshift shelters, windows covered with cardboard and plastic sheeting, blankets strung between shopping carts creating walls of fabric and desperation. A quiet order formed by people who had nowhere else to be, who had learned to build community from whatever materials remained after everything else was taken. The girl stopped beside an old sedan with peeling paint and a cracked windshield. Held together by duct tape, she turned, she waited. Her expression was blank, neutral, almost ceremonial. Like a guide who has completed her task and now steps aside for the revelation to speak for itself, Elliot approached. Breathing hard, sweat soaking through his $1,500 shirt, his lungs burning. From the first real physical exertion he'd experienced in months, maybe years, he looked nothing like the man who had stepped out of a luxury car minutes earlier. Nothing like the face that appeared in business magazines under headlines about disruption and innovation. From the driver's side door, a woman emerged young but worn down in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with systems designed to grind people into dust. She wore scrubs that were wrinkled and stained, the uniform of someone who worked overnight shifts. Caring for other people's parents while living in a car with her own chilled, her eyes were sharp with exhaustion and fury. The kind of anger that has been refined by months of injustice into something harder than rage, something closer to clarity. Behind her, inside the car, a small child coughed, a wet, rattling sound that lingered too long in the cramped space, the kind of cough that needed medicine and warmth and stability, the kind that got worse in cold cars under concrete overpasses. The woman held up the wallet, not as proof of theft, as proof of arrival, as evidence that the system she had spent months trying to navigate had finally delivered exactly who she needed, exactly where she needed him to be. Papers came next, eviction notices folded and unfolded so many times the creases had begun to tear, demolition orders stamped with official seals, documents written in the bureaucratic language that wraps quiet devastation in professional terminology, making displacement sound like policy rather than violence, property addresses, dates, red stamps declaring things final and non-negotiably, and a signature at the bottom of every page. As Elliot stared at the ink, he knew his signature. He had signed thousands of documents over decades. Contracts and checks and approvals that shaped the physical world according to his vision of progress. This one was wrong. The curve was too sharp. The angle was too steep. The final stroke ended where his never did, forged. But the damage was real. The woman's name was Shanice. She explained how men in suits had come with deadlines and clipboards, how 30 minutes was all they were given to pack up 15 years of living, how memories were reduced to what could be carried by hand while everything else was cataloged and removed by strangers wearing gloves, like the belongings themselves were contaminated. She explained how the bonuses worked, how each family removed added to someone's commission, how speed was rewarded more than accuracy, how signatures were confirmed by checking databases that no one had thought to update or secure, how her name was similar enough to a property owner 3 blocks away that the system flagged her as verified, how by the time anyone realized the mistake, the house was already empty and marked for demolition, how appeals took months, how living in a car while appealing meant missing work, meant losing the job that proved you deserved housing in the first place. The child coughed again, longer this time, the sound filling the car and spilling out into the space where Elliot stood frozen 2 weeks in a car cold. Nights when temperatures dropped into the 30s. No space to be sick safely, no address to put on school enrollment forms, no stability to offer a 6-year-old who kept asking when they could go home. Elliot looked around at the dozen other cars arranged in careful rows. The people living beneath concrete, organizing their days around public bathroom schedules and free Wi-Fi locations. At the children doing homework on carhoods. Using the last of the daylight before darkness made reading impossible. At the city, his company claimed it was improving. Made better by removing blight and attracting investment and raising property values for people who already had property to value. He saw what improvement looked like from below. What progress meant for people who weren't included in the glossy renderings. What urban renewal actually renewed, and for whom his phone buzzed again. The mayor's office. He declined the call. The woman Shanice watched him with something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't quite resignation either. Somewhere in between. The expression of someone who has learned to expect nothing but can't quite stop wanting something. Anyway, Elliot's voice came out rough. Can I see the house? The girl nodded. She had been waiting for that, waiting for him to ask the only question that mattered, waiting to show him what his signature had actually signed away. They walked. The girl led the way again. Shanice followed with her daughter, whose name was Imani, Elliot learned, which meant faith wrapped in a blanket despite the afternoon warmth. Shivering from fever and uncertainty in equal measure, the neighborhood revealed itself in layers. First, the abandoned buildings, windows like empty eye sockets, structures waiting for demolition or collapse, whichever came first. Then the stubborn survivors, houses where people still live despite everything, where gardens grew in defiance of decay, where laundry hung on lines strung between porches, where someone had painted a mural of hands holding up the sun, then the gaps where houses used to be, rectangular absences in the landscape like teeth pulled from a smile, leaving the remaining structures crooked and unsupported. The house stood at the end of a dead street. The kind of street that appeared on maps but had been abandoned by city services years ago. No streetlights, no trash pickup, no police patrols unless someone needed arresting. Small, worn, marked with a massive red X across its front wall. Condemned but not empty, the front door hung crooked on its hinges. Someone had forced it after the locks were changed, creating access for people who still believed they had the right to enter their own home inside. Dust hung in the air like something holding its breath. Waiting for permission to settle, furniture remained exactly where it had been left. A couch with a faded blanket folded over one arm. A dining table with a child's booster seat still attached. Family photos on walls clouded with grime but intact. Faces smiling from better times when the future felt guaranteed rather than conditional evidence of lives interrupted. Not abandoned, the kitchen sink still held dishes from the morning they were removed, breakfast plates with dried egg, coffee cups with rings of sediment at the bottom, the ordinary debris of ordinary life frozen at the moment everything changed. Elliot moved through rooms like someone walking through a museum of his own decisions. Each object a small accusation. Each detail evidence of what gets lost when spreadsheets replace stories in the living room. A bookshelf held children's books arranged by height. A small collection of trophies from youth soccer leagues. A framed report card with straight A's and a teacher's note about Amani's exceptional reading comprehension on the mantle. Photographs documented a family's history, Shanice pregnant and glowing Imani. As a newborn wrapped in hospital blankets. First birthday with cake smeared across a laughing face. First day of kindergarten with a backpack bigger than the child wearing at family dinners. Holiday gatherings. Ordinary moments made extraordinary by being remembered. These were the people his signature had displaced, not statistics, not obstacles to progress people. The girl led him down a narrow hallway, where wallpaper peeled in long strips revealing older patterns beneath. Layers of decoration marking decades of occupancy. Families who had lived here before Shanice. Generations who had made this structure into a home. She stopped at a doorway child-sized, painted purple at some point, now faded to lavender. The room beyond was covered in drawings. Taped to walls and ceiling, a cosmos of childhood imagination rendered in crayon and marker butterflies. And rainbows, families holding hands, houses with smoke curling from chimneys. The sun always smiling in the corner. Imani's artwork, Shanice explained quietly. Created over years. A visual diary of her daughter's inner world, but the girl wasn't pointing at the drawings, she was pointing at the doorframe. 6 marks carved into the wood, each labeled with a date, a height, a year. Growth measured by love, not money. Growth tracked with the precision of parents who understand that childhood is brief and every inch matters. The first mark was from 3 years ago, age 3, 2 feet 11 inches. The last mark was recent, age 6. 3 feet 8 inches. The girl, not Amani, but the one who had led him here, stepped into the frame. She lined up perfectly with the final mark. This house had recorded her becoming, her growth from toddler to child, her transformation from someone who needed to be carried to someone who could walk beside, her evolution from helplessness to independence, and now it was scheduled to disappear, demolished to make room for something more valuable, something that generated returns for investors rather than memories for children. Elliot felt something inside him break open, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. Maybe decades. Grief mixed with recognition, mixed with shame. He thought of another doorframe, another set of marks, another child whose growth had ended too soon. His daughter Sarah dead at 7 from an illness that money couldn't cure, despite every doctor, every treatment, every desperate attempt to buy more time. He had sold their house 3 months after the funeral. Unable to live with the doorframe that stopped measuring at 4 feet 2 inches, unable to walk past her room knowing no drawings would appear on her walls. He had built his empire partly to escape that grief, to fill the space her absence created with deals and developments and distance, and now here he was, staring at another child's measurements, another record of love made physical. The girl asked a simple question, her voice small and clear. When the house is gone, where do the marks go? Elliot had no answer, only the certainty that if the walls fell, something irreplaceable would be erased forever. Only The understanding that he had been erasing these things for years without ever seeing what they were, he knelt down so he was eye level with the girl. "What's your name, Maya?" Maya looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had learned to navigate systems designed to ignore her, that had developed the kind of wisdom that comes from being invisible. Until you need to be seen, she had planned this, the theft, the chase, the revelation. She had studied him somehow, learned his schedule, waited for the right moment, orchestrated this entire encounter because adults had stopped listening and children had to become tacticaltionists. Explain the rest, how Maya wasn't actually her daughter, how Maya's mother had been evicted 2 blocks away from a different forged signature, how Maya's mother worked 3 jobs and couldn't chase billionaires in the middle of the day, how Maya had volunteered, how she had practiced, how she had waited outside his building every morning for a week until she found her moment, how a 12-year-old girl had to steal a wallet to make a billionaire. See what his business was destroying? Elliot felt his phone buzz again. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, 57 missed calls. Now the ceremony was over. The questions were piling up. His absence was becoming a story. He turned the phone off for the first time in 15 years. He turned it completely off. Whatever came next could wait. This couldn't asterisk. They left the house together. Elliot, Shanice, Maya, and Imani still wrapped in her blanket. The walk back felt different. Slower, weighted with purpose rather than urgency. Elliot made calls as they walked. To lawyers first, then to his CFO, then to the head of his legal compliance division. His voice sharp and clipped in ways his employees recognized as serious. By the time they reached the overpass, 3 cars were already there, his people armed with laptops and briefcases and the kind of focused intensity that comes from serving someone who rarely asks for immediate action. The investigation started in a sedan, parked beneath the overpass. Documents spread across the hood. Shanice's eviction papers next to property records, next to transfer agreements, next to demolition orders. The forgery was obvious once you looked, but no one had looked. Why would they? The system was working exactly as designed. Speed over accuracy, volume over verification, results over righteousness. Elliot's lawyer, a woman named Patricia, who had been with him since the beginning, examined each signature under a portable magnifying light. 23 forgeries in the past 18 months, 23 families displaced, 23 homes marked for demolition, all in the same neighborhood, all processed by the same regional office, all approved by supervisors who were rewarded for clearing backlog faster than competing divisions. Patricia looked up, her expression grim. This wasn't negligence, this was systematic. Someone had designed a process that incentivized fraud. Someone had created bonuses tied to displacement numbers. Someone had removed oversight in favor of efficiency, and that someone worked. For Elliot, the CFO pulled up internal email subject. Lines told the story. Q3 targets ahead of schedule, regional office, leads and clearance rates, efficiency. Bonuses approved, cost savings exceeding projections, asterisk, language that sounded like success in a boardroom, but meant devastation in neighborhoods where people's entire histories were being erased by clerical speed. Elliot read through months of correspondence, executives congratulating each other, managers sharing best practices, regional offices competing for highest clearance numbers, no one asking if the people being cleared had anywhere to go, no one verifying if the signatures were real, no one checking if the laws being followed were just. The system had optimized for everything except humanity. His phone turned back on, immediately overwhelmed by notifications, but one text stood out from his PR director. "We have a problem. News vans at the ceremony site. Someone leaked that you abandoned the groundbreaking questions about where you went. Speculation. Building need guidance immediately." Elliot looked at Shanice, at Maya, at Imani coughing in her mother's arms. Then he typed a response. "Schedule a press conference. 2 horse will explain everything." His PR director sent back 3 question marks. Elliot didn't clarify. Instead, he turned to Patricia. "I want every family contacted, every fraudulent eviction reversed, every demolition stopped, every person who lost their home because of forged paperwork brought back into the process as full partners, not victims. I want criminal charges filed against everyone who knew and let it continue. I want the bonus structure eliminated. I want oversight rebuilt from scratch, and I want it done publicly." Patricia nodded slowly, already making notes. "This is going to cost millions, maybe tens of millions. Legal fees, settlements, reputational damage. The board will fight you." Elliot looked at the house visible in the distance, the red X still marking it for destruction. "Let them fight." The CFO cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know. The regional office responsible for these forgeries, it's run by Marcus Webb." Elliot Froze Marcus had been with the company for 12 years, had risen through the ranks faster than anyone had been Elliot's personal choice for regional director, had attended Sarah's funeral and sent flowers every year on the anniversary of her death. Marcus had built this system, the CFO continued. Voice careful, the efficiency bonuses were his idea. He presented them as innovation cost savings through streamlined processing. The board approved it unanimously. You praised him at last year's annual meeting, called him the future of the company. Elliot felt nauseous. He had celebrated this, had rewarded the architect of systematic displacement, had enabled everything he was now trying to undo. Maya was watching him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her expression said what words couldn't. Know you. Know how it feels to discover you're part of the problem. The press conference was held not at the ceremony site, but at the overpass. Elliot's PR team protested wrong optics, wrong location, wrong message. He ignored them. News vans arrived confused. Cameras set up on uneven ground. Reporters questioned the location choice while their producers scrambled to establish satellite connections behind Elliot. The encampment was visible, cars and shopping carts and people who lived in the margins. While his name hung on buildings downtown, he didn't use a podium, did read from prepared remarks, did allow his team to coach his language. He just spoke this morning. I was supposed to break ground on another development, another opportunity to transform what we in the industry call blighted neighborhoods into valuable properties. I was late because a young girl stole my wallet. She's 12 years old. Her name is Maya. She orchestrated a theft, not because she wanted my money, but because she needed my attention. She led me to see something I had spent 30 years avoiding, the truth about what my business actually does. What urban renewal actually means, who actually benefits when we talk about progress. He explained the forgeries, the systematic fraud, the incentive structure that rewarded displacement, the 23 families removed from homes they owned legally, the signatures that weren't theirs, the system that prioritized speed over justice. Reporters started shouting questions immediately. He raised his hand. I'm not finished. Behind me are people living in cars because my company, because I created a system that made their homelessness profitable for my employees. I didn't forge the signatures myself, but I built the environment where forging them made sense. Created bonuses for clearing properties quickly. I celebrated efficiency without asking about accuracy. I removed oversight because it slowed things down. I am responsible, not just legally, but morally. He introduced Shanisesh, stood beside him holding Amani. Her voice steady despite the cameras. My daughter has been sick for 2 weeks, scoffing in a car while I work overnight shifts at a hospital, taking care of other people's children. We were removed from our home based on forged documents, given 30 minutes to pack 15 years of memories told. We had no right to appeal because the demolition was already scheduled. My daughter asks me every night when we can go home, and until today, I had no answer. Now reporters were silent, cameras focused. The moment becoming something different than anticipated. Elliot continued. Every eviction process through fraudulent means will be reversed. Every family will be compensated. Every home scheduled for demolition will be evaluated by the people who live there, not by people who profit from their removal. Development will continue only with community approval. Land will be transferred into community trusts where residents make decisions, and I will personally fund housing for every family currently displaced. While we fix this, a reporter called out, "How much will this cost you?" Elliot met the camera directly. Less than it cost them. Another voice from the crowd. What about your board of directors? Will they approve this? If they don't, I'll resign and do it anyway. The PR director stepped forward, trying to end the conference, but Elliot wasn't finished. One more thing. The system that created this injustice isn't unique to my company. It exists everywhere development happens. Everywhere profit is prioritized over people. Everywhere signatures get checked against databases instead of against human faces. This isn't one bad employee. This is how the industry works, and I'm done pretending it's acceptable just because it's legal. He looked directly into the cameras. If you're in this business, check your processes. Check who benefits from speed. Check if efficiency measures humanity. Check if the people being displaced have anywhere to go, because if you're not checking, you're not developing, you're destroying, and calling it progress doesn't change what it is. The fallout was immediate and massive. The board called an emergency meeting. 3 directors resigned in protest. 2 threatened lawsuits. The stock price dropped 11% in the first hour of trading. Business partners issued statements distancing themselves from his comments. Industry associations suggested he had betrayed the sector. Competitors smelled blood and started circling pending projects. Everything he had built for 30 years felt suddenly fragile and somehow impossibly. He didn't care. The investigations moved faster than anyone expected. Marcus Webb was fired within 48 hours, arrested within 72, charged with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. 4 other regional managers were implicated. The bonus structure was eliminated completely. Oversight. Protocols were rebuilt with input from community advocates. Every pending demolition was frozen pending review. The family started coming forward, not just the 23 with forged documents, but others who had been displaced through legal but equally devastating means: eminent domain seizures below market value, pressure campaigns to sell before values dropped, further buyouts offered on Friday with Monday deadlines. Families who signed papers, they didn't understand because lawyers cost money they didn't have. The scale of it became clear slowly. Not 23 families, hundreds, maybe thousands when you counted the ripple effects. People who moved in with relatives after their landlords were bought out. People who left the city entirely when rents doubled. People who became homeless not through bad choices but through good ones, made by people who never saw their faces. Elliott created a fund, $50 million initially, then another $100 million when he realized the scope. Then he stopped counting and committed to whatever it took. Housing first, immediate shelter for every family in cars or on streets or in temporary situations covered for 6 months, while permanent solutions developed medical care for children like Amani who got sick from instability. The house with the door frame was repaired, not renovated, not transformed, not turned into something unrecognizable. Repaired. The red X was painted over, windows were replaced. The roof was patched, the plumbing was fixed, but the mark stayed, the wallpaper stayed, the drawing stayed. Everything that made it a home rather than just a house. Janice and Amani moved back in on a Wednesday afternoon. Maya was there, and Elliott, and a dozen neighbors who had known the family for years. No cameras, no press conference, just people helping carry boxes from a storage unit where Shanice had kept what she could afford to save inside. Amani ran to her room, stood against the doorframe, measured herself against the last mark. She had grown half an inch despite everything, despite the car and the cold and the coughing. She had ground. Shanice cried not from sadness, but from relief so overwhelming it needed sound to exist. Maya showed Elliott the new mark they carved, age 6. 3 feet 8.5 inches, dated that day. Proof that growth could continue, that measurement could resume, that home still meant something. Months passed, the neighborhood changed, not into something unrecognizable, but into itself. The gaps where houses had been demolished were filled not with luxury condos, but with new homes designed by residents, affordable, beautiful, built by local contractors hired at union wages. The community land trust held titles collectively. No one could be displaced without community approval. No developer could buy up blocks and flip them for profit stability. Replace speculation. Old homes stood beside new ones, not awkward, not mismatched, organic. The streetscape reflecting generations of occupancy rather than one moment of transformation. Trees were protected. The 100-year-old oak that developers wanted removed became the centerpiece of a pocket park. Children played beneath branches that had sheltered their grandparents' porches. Filled again, people sat outside. In the evenings, conversations happened across fences. The social fabric that displacement had torn began to reknit itself, but resistance came to other developers. Saw what Elliott was doing as betrayal. Industry groups published statements condemning his approach as economically naive. Investors pulled funding from projects that included community oversight. His company lost contracts, lost partners, lost the confidence of people who believed progress required removing obstacles rather than listening to them. The board forced him out after 8 months. Not fired exactly, pressured to resign, to step back, to let professional management restore profitability. Elliott accepted and used his severance to start something new, not a development company, a community development financial institution funded by his personal wealth, governed by a board where residents held majority control, designed to support projects that served the people who already lived in neighborhoods rather than people who wanted to move. In Marcus Webb's trial became a spectacle. Defense lawyers argued he was following industry standard practices, that efficiency was rewarded everywhere, that Elliott himself had created the culture that led to the forgeries. They weren't entirely wrong. The jury convicted him anyway. Fraud was fraud regardless of industry norms. He got 4 years out and 2 with good behavior. When he was released, Elliott offered him a job not in development, in oversight, reviewing community land trust applications, checking documentation, verifying signatures, using his knowledge of how to game the system to protect against people trying to game it. Marcus stared at him for a full minute before responding, "Why would you trust me?" Elliot's answer was simple, because you know exactly what we're trying to prevent, and because everyone deserves the chance you took from those families, a chance to start over. Asterisk the story spread in ways Elliot never intended. Other cities started asking questions about their own urban renewal programs. Community groups demanded oversight. Journalists investigated forgery rates in development zones. Patterns emerged everywhere, the same incentive structures, the same pressure to process quickly, the same prioritization of efficiency over accuracies. Some cities reformed, others defended their processes as necessary, but the conversation had changed. Development was no longer just an economic issue, it was a moral one. Maya became something neither she nor Elliot expected, a symbol not because she wanted to be, but because her story represented something people recognized. The impossibility of being heard, the necessity of being desperate, the moment when playing by rules designed to ignore you becomes impossible, and you have to break them just to exist loudly enough to matter. She was invited to speak at city council meetings, at community organizing events, at universities where urban planning students needed to hear from someone who had lived the consequences of their future decisions. She always brought the same message: we were always here, you just weren't looking, and when we tried to tell you, you called it complaining, so I had to steal a wallet to make you see, but I shouldn't have had to. Elliot attended most of her talk sitting in the back, never on stage unless specifically invited, not as a savior, not as a hero, as a witness to his own education, as evidence that change was possible even for people who had spent decades being the problem. After one event, a young developer approached him, early 20s, ambitious, eager to ask how to do development ethically. Elliot's answer surprised them both. Start by not developing, start by living in the neighborhood, start by knowing the names of people whose homes you're thinking about buying, start by understanding that every property you're calling an investment is someone's whole world, and if you can't see them as more important than your return on investment, find a different industry, because this one has done enough damage. The young developer looked confused. Then how do you make money? Elliot smiled. Asterisk. That's exactly the wrong question, but it's the one I asked for 30 years, so I understand why you're asking it. The right question is, how do you create value? For the people who already live somewhere, not for people who might move there, not for investors who will never see it, for the families who measure their children's growth on doorframes, for the communities that have been holding things together without your help. That's the question, and once you start asking it, everything changes. Asterisk. Years passed. The house still stood. The door frame had new marks now. Imani at age 7, 8, 9, growing steadily upward, each measurement a small victory, proof that stability enables growth, that home is the foundation for everything else. Janice had stopped working 3 jobs. The Community Land Trust employed her as a housing coordinator, helping other families navigate systems that still tried to be complicated, still tried to exclude, but were slowly, grudgingly becoming more human. Maya graduated high school top of her class, scholarships to 6 universities. She chose urban planning not because she wanted to develop, but because she wanted to stop what had happened to her from happening to anyone else. She wanted to redesign the systems that had required a 12-year-old to commit theft just to be heard. Elliot attended her graduation sitting with Shanice and Imani, not family exactly, but connected by the kind of bond that forms when someone shows you who you become and you choose to become someone different. In his office, awards still lined the walls, but the first thing visible when entering was a photograph, a doorframe covered in marks, 6 children from the neighborhood standing against it, measuring themselves, growing, proof that when development serves people instead of profit, everyone grows. The neighborhood had become a model. Other cities sent delegations. Community groups studied how the land trust worked. Developers who wanted to do better asked for guidance. Not all of them followed through, but some did, and slowly, one block at a time, the idea spread that development could serve the people who already lived somewhere instead of replacing them. It wasn't revolutionary, it was just obvious, but obvious things often take the longest to see, especially when not seeing them is profitable. Asterisk. The story ends where it began, with a chase, with a wallet, with a girl who knew that sometimes the only way to stop being invisible is to make yourself impossible to ignore. But the question doesn't end, because somewhere in your city, in your neighborhood, maybe on your block, the same thing is happening. Development presented as progress, displacement called improvement, erasure named renewal. The signs are there. If you look, rent increases that don't match wages, evictions that happen too quickly, families that disappear between 1 month and the next, empty lots where you remember houses, new buildings where you remember communities, the same language, Everywhere, revitalization, investment, enhancement, future words that sound like hope, but often mean removal. So the question belongs to you now: is the place you grew up still standing? Or did progress erase something it never learned how to replace? Do you know the names of the people who lived in houses that became vacant lots? Do you know where they went? Do you know if anyone asked them what they wanted before deciding what they needed? And if you don't know, why don't you? Because ignorance is a choice, and development that doesn't ask permission isn't development, it's theft dressed in legal languages. Though, here's what you can do: learn the history of where you live, not just your house, but your block, your neighborhood, people who were there before you, families who left, the reasons they gave for leaving, and the reasons they couldn't. Say out loud, ask questions at city council meetings, read development proposals, show up when decisions are being made, because they're being made whether you're there or not, and your absence is counted as consent support. Community land trusts, housing cooperatives, tenant unions, the organizations trying to create stability in a system designed for speculation. And if you're in development, if you're in real estate, if you're in urban planning, if you make money from buying and selling and transforming neighborhoods, stop for one day, walk through the places you're planning to change, knock on doors, learn names, ask what people want, ask what they're afraid of losing, ask if they want to stay, and then listen to the answer, not as a survey, not as a checkbox on a community engagement form, but as information more important than your projected returns. Because Maya shouldn't have had to steal a Wallachanis, shouldn't have had to live in a Karimani, shouldn't have had to be sick without shelter. None of it should have been necessary, but it was, because people like Elliot weren't looking, and people like Elliot aren't rare. They're everywhere, making decisions, signing papers, approving plans, calling it progress while people lose their homes. The difference is what happened after, when Elliot saw what his signature had done, when he chose to stop, when he chose to fix it, asterisk, when he chose to be uncomfortable with his own success rather than comfortable with other people's displacement. That's the choice, and it's available to everyone who has power over where people live, which, in a country built on property ownership, means it's available to more people than want to admit it. So the final question isn't about Elliot or Maya or Shanice or the neighborhood that survived. The final question is about you. What will you do when you discover you're part of the problem? Will you defend the system that benefits you? Will you explain why it's too complicated to change? Will you insist that everyone else just needs to adapt? Her? Will you chase the girl who stole your wallet, follow her where she leads, see what she needs you to see, and let it break you open enough to become someone different, someone better, someone who knows that door frames covered in growth marks matter more than quarterly earnings, someone who understands that home isn't an investment, it's where people become themselves, someone who builds distance from profit instead of people, because 30 years from now, when you look back at what you built, will you see towers with your name on them, or communities where children still grow? The choice has always been yours. Maya just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. And if this story made you think about what home really means, about who gets to stay and who gets displaced, about what progress actually costs, then do something with that thinking. Don't just feel moved, move. Because feeling bad about injustice without acting on it is just another form of consumption, another way to experience other people's pain without changing your own behavior. The story doesn't end with the billionaire learning his lesson, it ends with you deciding what you'll do with yours. Is the place you grew up still standing? Can the people who made it home still afford to live there? And if not, who benefited from their leaving? Follow that question wherever it leads, even if it leads back to you, especially if it leads back to you, because that's where Maya lead Elliot, not to villains in boardrooms, but to the mirror, to the realization that good people can build systems that do terrible things, that success can be measured in ways that make failure invisible, that you can genuinely believe you're helping while systematically hurting. The wallet was never the point. The chase was never about theft. It was about making someone see what they had spent a lifetime avoiding, and now you've seen it too. So what happens next is up to you. Will you look away, or will you keep following? Because somewhere right now, a 12-year-old is planning something desperate, not because she wants to, but because the adults have stopped listening, and the systems keep grinding, and the door frames keep being demolished, and nobody with power is paying attention unless someone makes them. That's the story. That's always been the story. The question is whether you'll be someone who needs to be chased, or someone who shows up before the stealing becomes necessary, before the desperation turns tactical, before children have to teach adults what humanity means. The Choices yours make it count because Maya is watching, and so are all the other children who will inherit. Whatever world we build, let them inherit door frames that measure growth, not vacant lots that measure profit. Let them inherit stability, not speculation. Let them inherit home, not just property. That's the legacy worth leaving. That's the story worth living. And it starts the moment you decide that other people's door frames matter more than your own distance from discomfort. The moment you decide to follow instead of flee. The moment you decide that seeing is more important than success, that moment is now. What will you do with it?